A cold winter's day in the year 1521, Gustav Eriksson, future king of Sweden, raced from the village of Sälen to the town of Mora to lead the people in an uprising against the Danish. This is the story behind Vasaloppet, one of the world's most famous long-distance cross-country skiing races. Every year, more than 15,000 people ski between the towns of Sälen and Mora in Sweden. It's a distance of 90 kilometers, and the fastest time so far is 3 hours, 28 minutes and 18 seconds. Unfortunately, that record is currently held by a Norwegian instead of a Swede, but at least it's not a Dane. Vasaloppet is actually the oldest cross-country ski race in the world, and it has the highest amount of participants in the world as well. You can probably say that it's pretty popular as a ski race. The first Vasaloppet was held on March 19, 1922, and the winner was a strapping young 22-year-old lad who won the grand prize of 1,000 Swedish crowns. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly 28,000 Swedish crowns or 3,000 American dollars. I think I'd require a bit more than that to go 90 kilometers on skis, personally. The modern Vasaloppet started in 1922, but it's based on a trip that took place much earlier. Let's go back in history to the year 1520. In 1520, the nations of Sweden, Denmark, Norway and Finland looked quite different from today. Denmark possessed all of Norway and big chunks of southern Sweden. Sweden was much smaller then compared to now, but on the other hand, big parts of Finland belonged to Sweden. The very north of Sweden was just a barren wasteland that no one wanted. It was full of reindeer, Sami people and maybe some Russians. The Nordic countries had been in a union called the Kalmar Union for over 200 years, with a single king that ruled over all the Nordic countries. That's the simplified version though. This was not a smooth working union, and there was a lot of resentment from just about everyone involved. Except possibly the Danes. In 1520, King Christian II was coronated in Stockholm, and that event was quickly followed by the Stockholm Bloodbath. King Christian rounded up all the rebellious Swedish nobles and had them executed on the main square in Old Town with the charge of heresy. 82 people were killed, and that gave King Christian II the nickname Christian the Tyrant in Sweden. There's a myth that while the Swedes call him Christian the Tyrant, the Danes call him Christian the Good. That's just a myth though. It hasn't been confirmed by any historical sources, even though it has been listed as a fact by some Swedish history books. He got the nickname Christian the Tyrant as propaganda. In particular, propaganda spread by a rebel called Gustav Eriksson, who was trying to rally the Swedes into an uprising against the Danes. Gustav Eriksson's father was killed during the Stockholm Bloodbath, as were two of his uncles and many other relatives, and all his estates were seized and the Danes were on the hunt for him. So Gustav Eriksson wasn't especially pleased with the Danish rule or with King Christian II. He tried to convince people in the southern provinces of Sweden to rise up against the Danish overlords, with no success. So he traveled north in Sweden instead. He traveled through the provinces of Småland, Östergötland and Sörmland, but his talk of rebellion didn't catch on at all. Finally, he decided to visit the province of Dalarna, where I am right now. He knew that the people of Dalarna had weapons and were made of sturdier stuff than the people in the south. In Dalarna, he traveled through a lot of villages and towns and tried to rally support against the Danes. Throughout his travels, he was hunted by the Danish, but loyal locals helped him out and saved him from being captured. The full story of Gustav Eriksson is quite impressive and quite interesting as well, but today I'm focusing on the events that led up to Vasaloppet. At Christmas in the year 1521, Gustav Eriksson held a big speech outside the church here in Mora. He made a big push to rally people into openly revolting against the Danes, but he was met with hesitation. People were sympathetic, but they didn't really want to take up arms, cause that could lead to dire consequences. Frustrated with the lack of determination in the people, he gave up on trying to rally the Swedes and decided to go to Norway instead. He strapped on his snowshoes and started the long journey westward. Just as Gustav Eriksson left Mora, Danish troops arrived at the town and started to give chase. The people of Mora rang the church bells in warning and tried to stop the Danes. They delayed the Danish soldiers enough so that Gustav Eriksson could continue his journey through the snow. He fled westwards towards Norway, traveling the cold and snowy path between the town of Mora to the village of Sälen, hunted by Danish troops all along the way. And that's where things changed. In Sälen, Gustav Eriksson was caught up by two of the fastest skiers in the province. They bore news that the people of Dalarna had changed their minds and they would rise up against the Danes, and they needed Gustav Eriksson to lead them. While the young rebel was fleeing west to Norway, news had come to Mora with more details about what happened at the Stockholm Bloodbath. This became the tipping point that angered the Swedes enough so that they would openly rebel against the Danes. This eventually led to Sweden becoming independent once more, and Gustav Eriksson being crowned King of Sweden under the name Gustav Vasa. Gustav Vasa led Sweden through huge reforms, and he basically created the modern Sweden. There's a lot more to say about Gustav Vasa, but today I'm focusing on his flight from the town of Mora to the village of Sälen. 90 kilometers through the snow in the cold of winter, being hunted by Danish troops. That's the journey we celebrate every year with Vasaloppet. There are some interesting things to note about this race. For one thing, there's another race called Vasaloppet, held in China every year. A Chinese sporting organization found themselves so impressed with Vasaloppet, so they decided to hold their own version in Changchun, which they found had a similar climate to the Nordics. So since 2003, there has been a Vasaloppet China in addition to the Swedish Vasaloppet up here. Another thing that's a bit curious about Vasaloppet is that it starts in Sälen and ends in Mora, but Gustav Vasa fled in the other direction. There's no interesting story behind that, unfortunately. It's just because of convenience. Mora is the bigger town, so it was easier to have the goal here, with all the administration that's required. A more significant thing to mention is that the whole story behind Vasaloppet could be fake. Gustav Eriksson was a young noble, and he probably couldn't ski for one thing. He may have traveled the route between Mora and Sälen, but in that case he did it on snowshoes and in a much more leisurely way. The stories about his panicked flight from Danish troops and how the locals saved him and hid him away are quite possibly made up. Some of the stories could be propaganda from the 1500s, and some could be made up by later authors who wanted to paint a grand picture of Swedish history. Regardless of that, it makes for a really interesting story. And even if the tales aren't 100% historically correct, it led us to having an amazing cross-country ski race that turned 100 years old this year. And that's well worth celebrating either way. That was the story behind Vasaloppet, one of the world's most famous cross-country skiing races. I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.